Most writing advice out there just isn't that great, be honest. If it was, you'd probably be too busy writing rather than looking for more writing advice. Storytelling is also somewhat subjective. The audience is not homogeneous. They want different things, they have different perspectives, which is a fact a lot of writing resources don't really address. If I want to do things properly, I realized I had to take matters into my own hands, and after several years of research and dedication, I finally present to you a system I'm calling the narrative compass. Just like how a webbed diagram represents the taste profile of foods such as wine or coffee, the narrative compass categorizes all narrative information into 8 fundamental types of immersion or sentiment. After analyzing each scene in a film, the system derives a set of metrics from a film's unique distribution of immersive information. Satisfaction metrics are concerned with the subjective preferences for different information types, assigning them a popularity ranking, while competence metrics treat all information types equally, but judge based on the substance and presentation of the information distribution across time. My system is a bit of a steep learning curve, but bear with me because besides helping you write, I believe this system will help you find the type of stories you really enjoy, learn about yourself in comparison to others as it pertains to taste in film, allow you to analyze narratives so you can make the most out of them, and just generally enrich your understanding of how fiction affects us. The system is akin to music theory but for fiction, and I promise you it will change the way you see storytelling. By analyzing a film's information distribution, the narrative compass is even able to derive a film's IMDb score. These metrics provide the basis for direct measurements of factors that affect the general audience's enjoyment of a film in both positive and negative ways. All these metrics are entered into a specific formula, 2 different formulas depending on the film's age, and it will return the film's IMDb score to a fairly high degree of accuracy. But before I can get into how all of this is done, I'll need to properly explain what all the metrics actually measure within the film. I have already briefly described each information type and each metric in my first video on this channel. It's not a prerequisite, but definitely check it out later. This video will explain the 3 information types that are categorized as implicit subtextual, being largely responsible for the thematic and interpretive elements of a narrative. This is the 3rd video in a 4-part series on the richness metric, but don't worry, these can be watched in any order. In the first one, I introduced the 3 information types related to creating intensity in the moment. In the second one, I introduced the 3 information types associated with characterization. And the last one, after this one, will be on the 3 information types related to external reality, predominantly focusing on plot. Because these videos are designed to be watched in any order, and because some of these information types share categories, this means I will be repeating myself in some areas. Returning viewers can just skip anything they're already familiar with. Richness is a measurement of the average immersive density of a film. The basic premise is that the more dense a film's scenes are in immersive information, the richer the narrative. Any given scene in a film will contain anywhere between 0 to all 8 types of information, and whatever number that is will be the density level of that scene. Although negative information is also possible, we'll get to that topic another time. We assess all scenes in a film and assign a density level to each one, and then based on that data, calculate the average immersive density for the whole film, from which we can derive the richness score. But we'll get into the mathematical specifics another time. Let's continue our demonstration of how to determine the immersive density level of a scene. We will use the scene from Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, where Puss first confronts the personification of death. It starts about 12 minutes into the film and lasts just under 4 minutes. And because it starts early in the film, it doesn't need much context, which is great for a demonstration. I will describe everything that happens in the scene and transcribe the dialogue. Then we will go through the list of criteria for each information type and determine which criteria does the scene meet, from which we can determine its level of immersive density. You can also look up the film clip that is the subject of our discussion here on YouTube and skip my reiteration. Before I begin to describe what happens in the scene, a little bit of context for people who might not be familiar with the film. In the first 12 minutes, we learn that Puss is a hero to some and a criminal to others. He's quite brazen and fearless since he has 9 lives. However, he realizes that he burned through his lives quicker than he initially thought and has already died 8 times before, which means his next death will be his final. The doctor implores him to retire from his life of adventure and suggests going to a cat retreat where he can be taken care of, which Puss promptly dismisses. So in this scene, Puss orders a glass of cream from a bar, and the bartender hands him the drink. "I am Puss in Boots, I am no one's lap cat," Puss proclaims in indignation. He takes a lick of the cream. "The doctor is a quack and a crazy man. He should have stick to cutting hair." "Last call, Senor Boots," the bartender calls out. "Another glass of cream. Make it your heaviest," Puss replies. "I keep the heavy stuff in the back," says the bartender and walks out of sight. Puss sits there for a moment. The candle blows out, he doesn't notice. "Retire. You're too good-looking to retire," he says to himself. He hears a tune being whistled. As he turns around, he sees a large hooded figure sitting next to him. "Well, well, if it isn't Puss in Boots himself," says the wolf, in the flesh. Puss in Boots acknowledges his presence. There's the famous hat, the feather, and of course the boots. "My compliments to your cobbler," the wolf continues. "Thanks. Good to meet you too," Puss says awkwardly and moves away from the wolf. "I never do this, but can I get your autograph? I've been following you for a long time," says Wolf as he shows Puss a wanted poster with his image on it. "Sign right there." He taps at the word dead. Puss in Boots laughs at the face of Death Bounty Hunter, says Puss. The wolf removes his hood. "So I've heard." Puss stands on the table and readies his hand near his sword. "You will find your reward does not come easily. This I tell you." "Everyone thinks they'll be the one to defeat me," Wolf replies, leaning over the bar to get another drink. "But no one escaped me yet. All right, let's get it over with." Puss grabs his sword. "Fear me, if you dare." Before he can finish his sentence, his sword is driven out of his hand and into the barrel behind them. The wolf just takes a sip. Puss walks over to his sword, grabs it, and says, "Okay, no more messing around." He runs at the wolf and takes a few swings. The wolf dodges them all while still sipping. Slow, sloppy, sad. The wolf catches his sword between his sickles and pushes Puss off the table. Then Puss makes his attack by swinging off the chandelier, but Wolf just catches him by the throat and says, "You're not living up to your legend, Gato," and throws him across the room. Puss is unable to defend himself and Wolf gets a cut in. Puss sees the blood on his paw and is paralyzed by fear. The wolf smells the air. "I just love the smell of fear," he says in a drawn-out and intimidating way. He slowly approaches Puss with his sickle scraping across the floor. Puss sees his lives flash before his eyes. "What's the matter? Lives flashing before your eyes?" Wolf asks. He kicks the sword towards Puss. "Pick it up." He says it again. Puss runs for his life, hides in the bathroom, and closes the door behind him. Wolf whistles as he approaches. His shadow looms over Puss. He searches for a place to escape. When Wolf enters, Puss is nowhere to be seen. He has escaped through the sewer. This concludes the scene. We will now go through the explanations and the criteria for the 3 information types found on the bottom of the compass, categorized as implicit or subtextual. These are the conceptually and thematically focused information types, being reflection, uncertainty, and system/milieu. Before we get into the information types themselves, a bit of a disclaimer concerning this category is needed. I'm using the word subtextual in the sense that these information types prompt some new form of input from the audience, and the appeal of their immersion largely relies on that input. These 3 information types can encourage the audience to create even more information than what is strictly in the text. These can give a sense of thematic depth to the narrative in the way that the other information types can't, at least not on their own. However, that sense of depth is coming specifically from engaging with that prompting. Which means if an audience member does not have the appropriate preferences for certain subtextual information types, a focus on some thematic aspects may feel empty rather than deep. Fiction is subjective, but subjectivity is still quite technical. I believe the differences in perception are most prominent with these implicit subtextual information types due to this prompting mechanism of engagement, which is responsible for creating different interpretations, observations, and evaluations. First, we have the reflection information type. Reflection is categorized as implicit and personal. It is the information type defined by characterization relating to the past or a character's perception of themselves and how they relate to the world that is often created by past experiences. Reflection-dominant narratives often involve character arcs or transformations, especially ones that rely on some kind of change in a character's values or development, such as a redemption arc, a lesson learned, a distinction between right and wrong, better or worse. It can be about the lies a character has been telling themselves, or it involves resolving something that was holding them back, such as trauma or insecurity. That aspect of personal development, that sense of making things right, is the primary appeal of reflection-dominant narratives. Negative character arcs and transformations, such as the failure to overcome flaws, learn a lesson, or outright devolve into tragedy, can also be included in the reflection sentiment. Reflection information often allows the audience to put themselves in a character's shoes, and through implicit comparison possibly even help contextualize and understand something about themselves. The nature of memory and past experience will inevitably mean that a character's perception and identity will be based on some kind of concept or framework of understanding. A character doesn't always have to reflect or talk about their own experiences to fulfill the reflection information type, but contextual attention still needs to be given to a character's past events or conceptual perceptions. The immersive purpose of reflection is to inform and contextualize characters in accordance to a character-related concept or framework. In reflection-dominant narratives, this concept or framework is then explored or progressed in some way throughout the narrative, becoming the thematic crux of the story, while in a more supporting use case for the reflection sentiment, simply provides the context for different people's value judgments and perceptions, adding a layer of perspective to your story. Either methods provide one of the ways the meaning role of fiction can be fulfilled. I generally associate the term character arc in its vernacular sense with reflection information, but it's a bit of a vague term. Audiences don't always need to engage with reflection and its conceptualizations to infer a character arc from a story. An influence-based character progression or a significant development of a relationship are also valid character arcs, at least in my opinion. Even an achievement-based progression is meaningful enough for some people. However, these progressions will be less deep or meaningful in a more thematic, conceptual, or communicative sense, and therefore will not be quite as satisfying or cathartic, or just generally as complete, unless they incorporate at least one of the two meaning information types, reflection or uncertainty, which provide a more powerful sense of eternal conflict and resolution. The difference is these two provide a psychological direction and a kind of wisdom to the meaning of the story, while the other progressions are more or less only focused on a goal. After all, this is the reason why character need versus want advice exists. But remember, people are different, therefore a character's personal development doesn't always involve conceptual introspection. So it's a case of squares and rectangles. All conceptual introspection is about personal development or failure, but not all personal development is about conceptual introspection. Personal development can also be achieved through uncertainty, but it's certainly the more chaotic option where the subconscious does all the work. Here are the criteria needed to fulfill reflection information requirements. Criteria 1. A scene establishes a character's normal range of experience, responsibilities, or recurring events or routines, a status quo. Criteria 2. A character experiences an event that has or will have a dramatic impact on the course of their lives, their motivations, beliefs, or mode of being, in a context of a dedicated character arc or progression. Criteria 3. A character reflects on or reveals their own or others' past actions or experiences that impacted a character's motivations, beliefs, or mode of being. Criteria 4. A character justifies their actions or lack of actions due to experience. Criteria 5. A character deals with ramification of past trauma, tragedy, or mistake. Criteria 6. A character shows a desire to redeem or rectify past mistakes or regrets. Criteria 7. A character acts in a way or does something that expresses moving on from the past, or the failure to do so. Criteria 8. The death of a character who experienced at least one of the previous reflection criteria. And criteria 9. A scene shows how an event impacts the beliefs or mode of being of a character or a larger group without a dedicated character arc or progression. Does our scene contain reflection information? Yes. The scene qualifies for criteria 2. Puss experiences an event that has a dramatic impact on the course of his life, which changes his mode of being. Puss becomes quite risk-averse and fearful after this confrontation, in contrast to his behavior at the start. With implicit information types, you need to consider a scene in the context of a larger narrative. The first 12 minutes of this film provided the context of Puss's self-perception, the idea that he's fearless. And the scene is specifically intended to create a change in that perception. In fact, the scene that follows depicts Puss holding a funeral for his legendary persona. It is the pivotal moment that sets Puss' transformational arc into motion, because the concept on which he based his identity has been shattered. So I would say it definitely qualifies. Because of this failure of agency and shattered perception of himself, Puss is pretty much forced into a situation where his values and concept of heroism and bravery need to be reconsidered, but he resists the pressures to transform almost every step of the way until the climax. To make things clear, a scene only needs to qualify for one criteria to fulfill the requirement of an information type. There are no extra points for fulfilling more than one criteria or anything like that. The criteria are just there to provide specific examples of how the immersive purpose of an information type can be achieved, but we are ultimately judging a scene on whether it fulfills that purpose or not. This means that in the future I might add additional criteria to the lists if I come across examples and stories that I judge to fulfill an immersive purpose, but don't have a criteria that describes it well. If we include the information types from our previous video installments, our scene now qualifies for 5 levels of immersive density. It now contains both the complete range of explicit information types, as well as personal, character-focused information types, including all 3 ways to create vicarious intensity and all 3 ways the audience can relate to character. There are 4 narrative roles or necessities of fiction that encompass the 4 reasons to engage with a fictional narrative, which are vicariously experienced agency, intricate connectivity, edge-of-your-seat anticipation, and the revelation of meaning. Reflection being one of the 2 methods by which this last necessity can be fulfilled. I've already talked a little bit about narrative roles in my previous videos, but we will look at them in even more depth when I cover the satisfaction metrics. So far, this scene contains 2 out of 2 ways to fulfill the agency role, using both achievement and influence information. It contains 1 out of 2 ways to fulfill the anticipation role, using rhythm information. It contains 1 out of 2 ways to fulfill the connectivity role, using relationship information. And finally, contains 1 out of 2 ways to fulfill the meaning role, using reflection information. The scene has now fulfilled every narrative role in some way, making this a necessity complete scene. From this point on, we will be discussing some of the less palatable information types, which are uncertainty and system in this video, and discrepancy in the next. For each narrative necessity, there is both a palatable and unpalatable method of fulfilling it. We already covered influence in the past video, which is also unpalatable, but it's the least unpalatable out of the 4. Palatable information is enjoyed unconditionally by the majority, while unpalatable information is only enjoyed conditionally, where it appears under the context of more palatable immersion. This doesn't mean that unpalatable information types need to be avoided or are inherently problematic in any way. They're just as valid as the palatable information types, they're just less popular. In fact, the inclusion of these alongside palatable information will improve satisfaction by improving variety, providing something of interest to more types of people. However, there are certain risks involved to the overall satisfaction of a story when placing the focus on these unpalatable, less popular forms of immersion at the expense of more palatable, more commonly valued forms of immersion, whereas a more palatable mix of information can somewhat compensate for a lack of variety. I will delve into the explanation of how I determined the popularity rankings of these information types later when covering the satisfaction metrics. In the process of writing about these unpalatable types, I have found that I needed to go off on some tangents regarding the current state of media discourse. But for the sake of focus and brevity, we will not get into them in these videos. The complete, continuous explanation of all 8 immersive information types, including the tangents, will be available to read on my Substack as soon as the argumentation within those tangents is expressed to my satisfaction. The purpose of these tangents is to demonstrate that many critics don't fully understand what fiction is, in my opinion, and how the misrepresentation of fiction has certain benefits to social and ideological maneuvering. I only make these tangents to steer the conversation back to the actual craft, which is what I am most interested in. The irony is not lost on me to the idea that I'm doing the same thing, simply offering a different type of ideology when it comes to understanding fiction. I only hope to demonstrate what I think is a better and more innovative way of doing things, which can hopefully avoid some of these pitfalls of contention and misrepresentation. My goal with the narrative compass is to provide a framework for expanding perception and seeing things from multiple points of view through the ability to recognize and understand the purpose of different information types within fictional narratives, including the ones you may not personally prefer or get value out of, which brings us to the least palatable out of all the information types: uncertainty. Uncertainty is categorized as implicit and neutral. It is defined by abstraction, intentional ambiguity, and open-endedness, and provides the other way of fulfilling the meaning role of fiction. This information type is related to existential uncertainty, conceptual abstraction, symbolism, myth, or spirituality. It often features the concept of the unknown. It sometimes features the destabilization of meaning or identity, which can pave the way for adaptation and/or humility. This form of meaning usually appears in the context of vulnerable psychological states or crises, often designed to elicit imagination or prompt an interpretation out of the characters in the story or the audience at large, or create a sense of awe and the feeling of being in the presence of something bigger than oneself. This form of information arises from the human ability to create meaning out of nothing, or at least nothing strictly rational or grounded. It is a kind of struggle with faith, although faith can present itself in a variety of ways. This is a real, observable ability in human psychology that arises out of necessity when other forms of established meanings or reliances fail. Now, this information type can be somewhat vague or even esoteric in certain circumstances, so in order to understand how to recognize it, I will be thoroughly drilling down into the precise definition of things. Uncertainty is perhaps one of the most elusive and subjective information types in its interpretation, but that does not preclude it from having specific criteria that it can be recognized by, just like all the other information types. For example, if I were to create a universal, secular definition of faith for storytelling purposes, I would define it as such. Faith is an evaluation made through the process of intuition. To be clear, that is the definition I will be referring to when using the word faith in this section. Let's first elaborate on what evaluation means in this context. Evaluation is the placement of value on something through the process of comparison. Something that I failed to mention while describing the reflection information type is that the reason why either reflection or uncertainty is required to create a character arc with a deeper meaning is because meaning is created through evaluation. Internal conflict and resolution is achieved by struggling with making and acting upon a difficult evaluation, where the difficulty often comes from insecurities, coping mechanisms, or simply the more external things that one stands to lose. This is the essence of personal growth. Now, that doesn't mean that a story that doesn't use the meaning information types all that much can't be meaningful. If you place value on a particular experience, be it agency, connectivity, or anticipation-driven, then immersing yourself in such an experience will be meaningful to you. Things are meaningful if you place value on them. However, the meaning information types, reflection and uncertainty, are designated as such because these specifically prompt some form of evaluation out of the characters and the audience, unlike the other information types which have other purposes. Meaning is the immersive purpose of these information types because these immerse you in the evaluation process as part of its intention, often through an arc of character progress that enables a value comparison. These two information types use two different methods of evaluation. Reflection uses conceptual introspection, while uncertainty uses, as I said, intuition. The definition of intuition, according to Carl Jung, who's one of the founders of psychoanalysis, is perception via the unconscious. It is an irrational function that perceives possibilities and meanings beyond conscious logic or sensory data, working through unconscious associations to lead to insights, ideas, or new paths without conscious reasoning, often feeling like a sudden revelation. Back when describing the reflection information type, I associated uncertainty with the subconscious, but what I meant was the unconscious. I tend to use these terms interchangeably, but they do have a distinction. Unconscious being the deeper, less individually influenced consciousness of the two. I want to add that faith and intuition can be associated with the feeling of just knowing, without being able to adequately articulate why. If this information type can provide a sense of ineffable certainty, then why did I call it uncertainty? Well, that's because the conditions that are needed to get to this feeling require an uncertainty that conceptual introspection is not able to handle on its own. The aspect of uncertainty is essential. If no meaning can be found or no reliance feel adequate, your intuition will have the space and freedom to create a new one for you. Although sometimes an attachment to meaninglessness itself can become a reliance that prevents the intuitive process, it's funny how that works. I want to clarify that the appearance of abstractions, metaphors, symbolism, surreal imagery, and spiritual references in a vacuum do not qualify as examples of uncertainty information. The uncertainty sentiment is expressed in a story when it can present the conditions under which these abstract conceptualizations or surreal images are needed or spontaneously arise. Those conditions often involve challenges such as undergoing changes not in one's control, existential discrepancies, or the facing of the great unknown. Uncertainty, like all the immersive sentiments, need to be based in sensation. Intuition is a form of perception at the end of the day. The conceptual end product of intuitive evaluations is not as important to a story as the way circumstances are being perceived and acted upon. Detached, vague, or conceptual musings on the relevant subject matter will not quite suffice for that reason, unless their purpose is to inform personality or establish aura or voice, in which case these will be classified under relationship, or inform spiritual systems in the context of a setting, in which case these would be classified under system/milieu. Neither would these musings be particularly meaningful or profound as the writer most likely intended them to be. Portraying the conditions of uncertainty is the key here. If the element of uncertainty is missing, this kind of stuff amounts to nothing more than fluff, woo-woo, and vanity. The uncertainty sentiment, faith, or intuition can also be described as seeing with the soul, or if you want to be more sappy, as feeling with the heart. Now, associating the phenomena with the heart actually makes a lot of sense. The heart is positioned halfway between the head and the gut. All three are a metaphor for a type of cognition. The head obviously represents the conscious, more rational, conceptual form of cognition. The gut represents a more primitive form of instinct. Therefore, the heart represents intuition, which is something in between. A higher order of instinct, if you will, but still a pre-rational one. All three have certain advantages and disadvantages, mainly that intuition is much faster at making connections than conceptual introspection, at the expense of being less articulate. And unlike the gut instinct, which is just as fast, intuition has a much better sense of future anticipation through finding new possibilities, whereas instinct is stuck with what past experience has taught it. It's almost like you've got a rock, paper, scissors situation with these three cognitions and their strengths and weaknesses. I didn't actually plan this, but Puss in Boots: The Last Wish provides a great demonstration of all three cognitions in action. The panic Puss experiences is instinct in action. The spontaneous imagery that appears as Puss's life flashes before his eyes in the first confrontation with death is the intuition in action, making a spontaneous, involuntary evaluation of what is truly valuable. It takes Puss the length of the film to re-experience and reconnect to what is deemed valuable by the intuition, all the while his conscious goal seeks a comfortable and familiar return to the status quo. The climax of the film is the moment that the conscious form of evaluation catches up to the unconscious, intuitive evaluation, in which Puss can now articulate and consciously act upon this new evaluation. Now, the story provides a good representation of these forms of cognitions, but there's another level to storytelling in which certain cognitions, certain forms of evaluations can be stimulated in the audience themselves, or at the very least modeled by the characters in the context of their vulnerable circumstances. Unconscious intuition plays an important part in the narrative arc of Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, but in terms of what cognition or evaluation method it is being more frequently stimulated in the audience, across the duration of the film, the reflection information type absolutely dominates. The right thing to do is kind of obvious in this film, and there is little to no doubt or uncertainty as to what course of action will result in the best and most satisfying outcome. Uncertainty-dominant narratives aren't quite so cut and dry. They often require for the more reliable evaluations to fail, where the focus becomes the process and the experience of faith-based evaluations, which are distinctly different and specifically reserved for such uncertain conditions. The nature of uncertainty's distinct yet elusive purpose is to create room for open-endedness in either the narrative itself or a character's personal experience, and through this evoke a desire to fill in or resolve those gaps by stimulating a more intuitive, imaginative, and abstractive way of interpretation, stringing connections, inferring meaning, and making evaluations. The reason why I said that uncertainty information can sometimes be seen as nihilistic in a previous video is because firstly, it may use failed reliances or disillusionment as part of the evaluative process, but secondly, because if an audience member does not get immersed in the intuitive process, resolve those gaps themselves, and create their own meaning, well then there's no meaning to be found. End of story. It's a matter of both taste and outlook. In Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, uncertainty information is used in a way that reinforces and gives depth to reflection information, and then this story at least is entirely contained by the reflection sentiment of conceptual introspection. This is what the meaning palatability score measures. It's an indication of how consciously articulate are the evaluations in the story, and also how important is the process of evaluation to the overall experience. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish scores very highly on this metric. If the ratio of uncertainty to reflection was reversed, with uncertainty information dominating reflection information, the experience, although just as focused on the process of evaluation, here would be less articulated and more open-ended, in which reflection might only appear in an unreliable or maladjusted context, mostly contained by the uncertainty sentiment. There's nothing invalid in having a story take this sort of creative direction. Indeed, there are certain unique benefits to this type of experience you won't find in many places. However, I did say there is a risk involved when focusing on unpalatable immersion at the expense of palatable immersion. Uncertainty, done right, will stimulate unconscious perception in the audience. But the issue is you don't know what's in there. You don't know what's in the unconscious of the audience members. You don't know what their personal conditions are like. You don't know what kind of associations they will make. Since the meaning is not consciously articulated, yet an intuitive evaluation is prompted, some very strange, ungrounded, and often irrational interpretations, connotations, and inferences can happen, accompanied by a sense of ineffable certainty of the fact which can amount to some bizarre claims. especially made by people not recognizing they're making personal interpretations. You can't really take criticisms of uncertainty-dominant narratives at face value, you just have to experience it for yourself. You may or may not be into it depending on your preferences and interpretations. Now, that doesn't mean uncertainty-dominant narratives are above criticism, but what it does mean is that any criticisms, specifically in regards to the execution of any supposed meaning, message, or meta-intention, become void in the light of the mechanism of evaluation used. The meaning is so subjective by purpose and design that the only way to be critically objective about an uncertainty-dominant narrative is to recognize the mechanism and delineate your own interpretations, rather than critically engage with the meaning in evaluations which you yourself have created while pretending you didn't. So here are a list of criteria to help you recognize the mechanism of uncertainty immersion. Criterion 1. A character deals with an existential crisis, discrepancy, or uncertainty where an identity, ideological, or principle-based reliance is challenged. Criterion 2. A character responds to adversity in whatever way that allows them to self-regulate. Criterion 3. A character wants to explore or understand something mysterious, out of bounds, or considered forbidden or taboo. Criterion 4. The presence of symbolic, supernatural, spiritual, or abstract concepts or elements alluding to something bigger than ourselves. Criterion 5. Highly evocative or symbolic imagery that doesn't work on a literal level. Criterion 6. The presence of contradictions, oxymorons, or paradoxes that carry meaning. Criterion 7. Unresolvable or open-ended mysteries or miracles. Mysteries that cannot be solved by gathering information, such as soft magic. Criterion 8. Vague or cryptic motivations of higher powers or supernatural beings. Criterion 9. An action is taken based on faith, not principle or past experience. Some clarification on the criteria before we move on. The word existential in Criterion 1 can refer to mode of existence as well as existence itself. So this criterion will include threats as well as significant changes to accustomed existence that a person initially cannot handle or adapt to. Criterion 3, exploring something out of bounds, is relevant to uncertainty due to intuition's ability to present new possibilities. And this course of events can also provide a path for adaptation in the context of a crisis described in Criterion 1. Since implicit information types need to be considered in the context of a narrative as a whole, criteria 4 to 9, the supernatural, paradoxical, cryptic, and faith-based elements, ideally need to present themselves in the context of a narrative in which either criteria 1 to 3, crisis, regulation, or exploration, are also present. Otherwise, the portrayal of these experiences will not have the adequate basis in sensation. In summary, reflection can be considered a self-concerned form of meaning, in contrast to uncertainty, which is self-unconcerned. Neither of them are necessarily good or bad, because both boil down to simply a set of different mechanisms that are made available to our psychology, with their respective applications and purposes. It's more of a question of how these might be causing someone suffering or holding one back. The alternative can provide an effective antidote, but even this is an oversimplification due to how intertwined these mechanisms are. The appeal of uncertainty-dominant narratives is to create an enigmatic experience that adds wonder, awe, humility, and even in some cases tragedy or a bittersweet sensation of one's understanding of either oneself, reality, and or the human spirit within it. The main thing that it is open to interpretation, where your own intuition would lead you to is uncertain. Does our scene contain uncertainty information? Absolutely. The scene fulfills Criterion 1. Puss experiences an existential crisis in which his identity-based reliance is challenged. Puss saw himself as fearless. He never considered death as a serious matter, which in turn made him not see life as a serious matter. He's challenged and defeated in a fight, which brought him close to dying for good. and this experience challenges everything he thought he knew about himself. This sensation of uncertainty is what prompts the intuitive evaluation, which Puss's conscious thought spends the rest of the film catching up to. You might have noticed that criterion 1 of uncertainty is in some ways similar to criterion 2 of reflection, which is where a character experiences an event that has or will have a dramatic impact on the course of their lives, their motivations, beliefs, or mode of being, in a context of a dedicated character arc or progression. You may be thinking, isn't this redundant? Since this scene fulfills both of these criteria, what is the difference? It is the difference between meaning curation and meaning creation. The former is contextualizing, the latter is elicitative. A scene or a narrative at large can contain both. Reflection-dominant narratives often use this criterion of uncertainty to break through inferior self-perceptions. So criterion 1 can be very much tied to reflection information as a dynamic disruptor. But alternatively, criterion 1 can be used for humility and ego death, where the uncertainty sentiment may even replace the need for a reflection sentiment, paving the way for a less self-concerned approach to meaning. Another criterion of uncertainty that can be argued to have been fulfilled by this scene is criterion 4, an abstract concept that alludes to something bigger than oneself. Death and the obliteration of self that comes with it does qualify for this definition. Although the wolf does not yet explicitly reveal that he is the personification of death in this scene, it does give enough clues to make that interpretation. There are the 9 lives etched on his sickle. There is the transformation of perceived reality through enhanced imagery and color, but also the way Wolf's shadow looms over Puss in the latter part of the scene seems to defy physics, which either suggests something supernatural about the figure, or it's a stylistic choice to communicate an idea abstractly, which is why I say it fulfills criterion 4. Although later, on closer inspection, I've realized that there is an opening over the door to the toilet, which means the shadow doesn't actually defy physics. The presentation of the wolf in this scene still evokes a sense of horrific otherworldliness. Nevertheless, it elicits imagination, where that sense of second-guessing what you're seeing actually works in favor of fulfilling the uncertainty information type. Our scene now qualifies for 6 levels of immersive density in total, and uses both of the available ways of fulfilling the role of narrative meaning. This is a point at which I added a tangent in my original script, the details of which I will briefly summarize here. I reveal that immersive palatability, this conditionality of enjoyment of certain information type, appears to be a recent phenomena. That's the reason why I need 2 different formulas to accurately derive IMDb scores of films depending on their age. I found that older films don't need to account for palatability, and in this tangent, I share my speculations and hypotheses as to what might be going on. Let's move on to the last information type that we will talk about in this video. Next is the system or milieu information type. It is categorized as implicit and external. It is the information type defined by setting or system context and observational prompting. The immersive purpose of system milieu information is to provide details about a setting or a system within a story to facilitate engaging observation or inference of the reality the narrative presents. The definition of a setting can encompass anything that can be directly or physically observed in a place, while the definition of system can encompass the number of the following, such as technology, culture and history, language, rules and customs, laws and governance, dynamics of nature, functionality or special abilities of fictional beings, magic systems, or even sufficiently externalized relationships between large groups of people or factions of interests. All these can be either allegorical, inspired by reality, or be predominantly fictitious. System milieu is one of the 3 implicit subtextual information types which prompt the creation of additional information to what is strictly present in the text. Reflection creates additional information by prompting evaluations and comparisons, where it relates to perspective, personal introspection, or identity conceptualization. Uncertainty creates additional information by prompting interpretations of abstractions and open-ended imagery. And system milieu creates additional information by prompting observations, external comparisons to the real world, and logical or consequential inferences. The criteria for system milieu information are as follows. Criterion 1. The scene provides real or perceived details of a setting. Criterion 2. The scene establishes the perceived or real workings of any type of system. Criterion 3. The scene informs how certain actions or circumstances create consequences in a system or setting. Criterion 4. Conflict or tension is resolved or a goal is achieved through the use of system rules or setting context. Criterion 5. The scene provides an experience of one's surroundings. Criterion 6. Immediate surroundings provide clues to the nature of the larger setting. It's a bit anticlimactic to inform you that the scene from Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, in fact, the film as a whole is essentially devoid of this information type in its storytelling. There's no indication of how the conflict between Puss and Wolf in this scene has any effect on the setting or a larger community. It doesn't present this event as a consequence of a setting or system either. Puss in Boots the Outlaw isn't framed as a Robin Hood figure, whose behavior is informed as a response to the setting or environment he finds himself in, or anything like that. His behavior is framed as an extension of his life experience and his individualistic proclivities. The focus and theme of the story is personally implicit, not externally implicit. System milieu information is not necessary to the premise or execution of this narrative. There are only 2 instances of system milieu information in this whole film. Both of these involve a magical functionality that is helpful in telling a very internally focused story. One establishes that an object that can undoubtedly grant wishes exists in this world, and the other shows that the magical forest setting changes based on the mental state of its map's possessor. In the scene of our demonstration, there is a reference to the doctor also being a barber, a setting-related detail. I would categorize this information as being referential rather than immersive. It is simply a reference to a factoid about medical care in the medieval period. The reason why there are references to the medieval period in this film is because the Shrek franchise uses a lot of characters from fairy tales and folklore who trace their origins to around that period. This is more of a surface-level stylistic nod rather than a narratively immersive detail, therefore does not quite qualify as system milieu immersion. You can argue that the setting of Puss in Boots: The Last Wish does not amount to anything more than a superfluous aesthetic, but that is only a problem when the narrative diverts a significant portion of its focus towards system milieu immersion through observational prompting, and yet it still does not arguably amount to anything more than a superfluous aesthetic. System milieu is not relevant to this narrative, and therefore the superficiality of its setting isn't an issue. It's simply not the focus. So far, our scene qualifies for 6 levels of immersive density, and it contains 2 out of 3 implicit subtextual information types. It contains reflection, uncertainty, but not system milieu. The scene contains thematic implicitivities of personal and neutral nature, but not external nature. I have written a few more additional tangents in regards to the implicit information category as a whole, but as I said, these will not be featured in this video. During the videos focused on the richness metric, we're only concerned whether or not a scene contains any given information type, but next we will cover the impact metric, which is concerned with the order the information types are prioritized in each scene. Certain configurations are more conducive to the creation of conflict than other configurations, which is something we will get into in due course. This concludes this video, but in the next we will be covering the last information type left, the other way of fulfilling the anticipation necessity, the discrepancy immersive information type.